All right, I welcome the Heritage Foundation of Williamson County's Warwick Lecture Series for April 2021. I'm Blake Wintry, the Director of Preservation at the Heritage Foundation of Williamson County. Named for the county historian Rick Warwick, the Warwick Lecture Series is a quarterly local history or preservation-focused program. And we usually focus on some aspect of history in Middle Tennessee or preservation. Our July 8th lecture is planned to be in person. So right now, at this moment, it's planned to be in person at the Franklin Theater with Williamson County historian Rick Warwick. Rick is going to present on Faces of Our Past based on his collection of daguerreotypes and portraits. And Rick has lots and lots of photos. So if you visit his Flickr, you can see all kinds of great history he's collected. We're recording tonight's lecture with Dr. Ashley Bouknight-Claybrooks. Please keep yourself muted and your video off, and use the chat section to ask your questions, and we will go through those at the end of her presentation. With that, I'm going to turn over introductions to my co-host, Rachel Finch, who is the Senior Director of Preservation at the Heritage Foundation.
Thanks, Blake. We're so glad that everybody's joined tonight for this very special presentation on interpreting American slavery at historic sites with Dr. Ashley Bouknight-Claybrooks presenting for us. I think it's important for us to have this conversation, particularly within the past couple of years with how we're noticing a change, and a very swift change in the conversations around the ideals of slavery, and how museums and historic sites play a role in interpreting and helping us understand the issues of American slavery. And for the last 2 decades, historic sites around the country have been engaged in a steady, thoughtful discussion about slavery and race. We all know that this conversation isn't comfortable or easy, but it happens consistently, and it happens with the authenticity and veracity that can only happen in an old place, in a place where history happened and history is preserved and history is connected to the present. It's also how we tell the stories of the African-American experience of resistance and resilience, freedom, trials, perseverance, and tenacity. And I'm so pleased tonight to have my friend and colleague, Dr. Ashley Bouknight-Claybrooks, who is currently serving as the Senior Manager of Professional Development for the American Association of State and Local History tonight to present on interpreting American slavery at historic sites. Curator formerly at the Andrew Jackson's Hermitage, and prior to her work in Nashville, she served as a community educator and museum consultant for various museums, historic sites, and neighborhoods with history projects in the Southeast. She's received her master's in public history and a certificate in museum management from the University of South Carolina, and her Bachelor of Arts in historic preservation and community planning from the College of Charleston. She received her PhD in public history from Middle Tennessee State University right here in Murfreesboro, and her research focuses on collection management theory, intersectionality, and inclusivity in museums and community outreach. And tonight, we're just very pleased to have you here, Dr. Bouknight-Claybrooks. So please, with that, begin your presentation.
Thank you so much. I am going to share my screen. Let's see if I can get this. Okay. So I am going to begin our presentation tonight titled Interpreting American Slavery at Historical Sites, the same way that I start most of my presentations. And that would be by honoring my own ancestors, as well as the ancestors of the enslaved individuals who were on American soil. And I hope that the conversations that we have tonight continue to uplift their legacy. And I hope that it also uplifts the legacy as my colleagues continue this work as well. So before we really get into the meat of the topics, I really want to emphasize that there are going to be terms and phrases used in this presentation. And they're not always the most fun terms to come across, but I like to often give trigger warnings. Terms such as there's no such thing as a good slave owner, enslaved, racism, privilege, white supremacy, Black bodies as capital, as well as sexism. And as we move through these conversations, know that just because items are uncomfortable, that does not mean that a historical event is should be designated a secondary narrative. And with that being said, let's go ahead and do away with terms such as controversial, radical, difficult, or other history or story. Because to be honest with you, there is nothing controversial or radical about the existence of Black and Brown bodies in a space. Just because they make you uncomfortable, they are still main stories. These individuals still require the agency of having very high priority in our interpretive landscape. So what does that mean for us? We feel that sometimes these stories are uncomfortable. They are really difficult to digest. However, we have to remember that we are still stewards of all of these histories. It is not just about the information that makes us comfortable, but we have to maintain, we have to preserve, and we have to interpret and share all of these narratives, no matter how we personally feel about them. Because at the end of the day, we do not own this material. This material was placed in our laps because they are important, because they need to be shared with generations down the line. So remember, you don't own this material. And with that, refrain from using possessive language on tours. Refrain from saying things such as my tour or my soldiers or my insert name of enslaved person here. Think about how that would sound on the other person receiving that information. So as stewards, being careful of how we're saying the information is important because again, we don't own this material. And also, as we're going through this material, remember that we have to allow the individuals at the core of our interpretation to tell their own stories, not through the lens of oppressors. So as we're going, just an example, if you are doing an interpretive tour at your site, make sure that you are elevating the stories of the enslaved person and not showing their stories through the eyes of the enslaved person's owners or oppressors, because you are not giving those enslaved persons or some of these other individuals that we've relegated to secondary status on our tours, you're not giving them the opportunity to show themselves as full human beings, because they were more than just quote unquote slaves. And no, I said enslaved persons and not slaves, because enslaved, being a slave is not who they are. That is what they were, what it's the title they were given as far as what they had to do for work, for upkeep on the site. So making sure that we're calling them enslaved persons is important. And this next point I want to make as far as your bias. As you enter these spaces, as you make the decision to discuss enslaved persons, you have to remember that you always come with your personal bias, and it will affect how you interpret material. And I say always, and I really do mean always. No matter where you come from, what your economic status is, your race, your age, your education level, all of that material affects how you interpret these narratives. And as stewards of this material, before you even approach a group to talk about these topics, sit down with yourself. Think about all of the issues that you've had with these topics. Think about why these things are controversial to you, why they are difficult, why they seem radical. And oftentimes it goes back to our own personal trauma. There is a colleague of mine who I absolutely adore, that when she gives her her lectures on how to interpret slavery, she emphasizes the importance of mental health and mental health awareness for interpreters. I know that when I was a curator, I had a therapist. After I had my daughter, I went to therapy twice a week because dealing with these topics as a Black woman working on a former plantation that had enslaved persons was difficult. And I had to acknowledge that I brought my own set of trauma and triggers to that job every day. And that I had to sit with that information moving forward in order to properly do my job. But those are my rights. I couldn't do away with them. And from then, even now, they will always affect how I do the work. Also remember that stewardship is a long-term commitment. This is not a to-do list for your diversity checklist. I know I may have stepped on a few toes with that comment, but it is the honest truth. If you want to approach dealing with more genuine, inclusive stories and narratives, you have to make sure that everyone on your staff is committed to making these long-term projects and partnerships with not only the descendants, if possible, of these enslaved persons, but also the surrounding community. We want to make sure that everyone knows that you are genuinely invested. And a lot of folks on this call probably know that if you are not genuinely invested for the long run, folks will know. Your community will be very aware and you will not receive the long-term support that you want. So make sure, again, that this is a long-term commitment and that you are trying to incorporate this inclusive narrative in every aspect of your site, not just the tours that you've created. So now, how do we begin the conversations? How do we begin to talk about these topics that we initially called difficult and controversial? And on my end, when I decided to really approach this, I felt like we really had to get to the heart of the matter. And the topic was difficult, but we needed to define race. We needed to talk about race at the core of American slavery and why race was a social construct that was created to justify slavery. Because race-based classification systems were used to determine social hierarchy in order to define how Africans as well as Indians or Native Americans were considered inferior classes. And these concepts were used to justify slavery. This is an important concept that's often forgotten as we're going through these interpretive narratives. It is important. It is so important to continually acknowledge the role race plays in that. And so what are we looking at historically? We're looking at scientists, biologists, we're looking at phenology, these concepts that were created and connected it to science, these pseudoscience theories that are saying if someone is of this race, they are biologically inferior to another, to someone who is farther, who is not connected to whiteness. It is an uncomfortable truth, but it is the truth. And these concepts is how they said they can enslave an entire race of people. That is a hard concept to talk about on a tour or some type of interpretive narrative, but it is the truth. And I would include this information in any tour that I share with guests, because they had to understand how can an entire race of people be subjugated to the level that we saw in the United States. It was this scientific theory that was able to continue this system for over 400 years. And you have this theory of the degeneration theory. You have a naturalist and mathematician who said that it was the mixing of races that caused the degeneration of whiteness, and that it wasn't just with biological degeneracy caused by interbreeding, but it was also cultural degeneracy. So you're talking about sharing customs and speech, and it was diluting this concept of whiteness. So they connected science, they connected social structures in order to create this theory that says we have scientific backed information to say that placing these groups of people as enslaved persons was okay because science has proven that this makes things okay.
Hey, Ashley, can I interrupt you for just a second? Some people are complaining about the audio, and it sounds like your audio is better when you're closer to your screen.
Gotcha.
So I don't know if there's a way for you to make some minor adjustments, but there's some people having a hard time hearing.
No problem.
But I'm doing really well with the speaker. I plug the speaker into my computer. I can hear you pretty good, but some people have some complaints.
No problem. I can't see the chat while I'm on here, so thank you so much. I appreciate that. So I'll sit a little bit closer. So after we talk about the definitions, after we talk about race and how race was defined, we look at how that was used to create this economic system of American slavery. So you've defined race, you've defined how these people are categorized. Now, how do we keep this system moving with this economic system? So you have three different components that I usually discuss. We talk about the importance of land, we talk about the importance of technology, we talk about the importance of trade. And with that, let's look at land. So how am I discussing the importance of land in regards to human capital? So in the antebellum period, we know that land equaled wealth. The more land that you had, the more wealth you had. And land speculation was a huge occupation for individuals. And we know that trade, both domestic and international trade, depended on the US expanding. And with that expansion comes the necessary evil of human casualties. Human casualties created the American social caste system. This is a hard pill for folks to swallow. We know about the importance of land. We see various plantation sites, the sprawling landscapes. We like to talk about the amount of land that some of these slave owners acquired. But why? But who worked this land? Why were they pulling so much effort to build this wealth of land? And again, who was working the land? We oftentimes separate these two concepts, but we can't. They all need to go together to really understand and really to explain on our interpretive tours what's going on with the individuals on these properties. We also have to talk about trade. You know, how does this idea of human capital fit into domestic and international trade? So as people are acquiring more land, we see that there's an increase in demand for more enslaved persons, which means the value of these individuals are going to go up, which means the demand for goods are going to go up, which means there is an increase in demand for raw materials, and therefore the cycle continues. And this also makes a point of bringing in ideas of slavery was not a system based solely in the South. We often forget to talk about the importance of the industrial economy in the North and how the demand and supply for raw goods in the South that was sent to the North, but these raw materials were gathered by enslaved persons. all concepts that need to be included in these conversations. You cannot separate trade. You cannot separate the importance of land. So how do we break this down even further? How do we explain to guests what the value of human capital really was? So we're looking at the value of enslaved persons. And when someone is trying to calculate what this was worth in terms of land, the value of an enslaved individual equal the amount of expected output minus the cost to maintain the person. And these values will fluctuate based on age, gender, geographic region, their ability to read and write, form of punishment, things of those sorts. But that value of that individual could be used as lines of credit. Lines of credit could be used to buy more land and slaves. And so again, this is showing how you connect that human capital with that land, with that amount of property, with trade. They're all connected. And separating any one of those pieces from the conversation does not do your topic any service at all. And to really sum that up, people often ask me on some of the tours that I've done, and it was, so why didn't America just abolish slavery? It wasn't that simple. It was, if you abolish slavery, it would have been in direct contrast to an owner's self-interest. It would have crippled the economy of the South. It was severely stagnated the industrial production of the North. It would have limited the ability to trade internationally, and it would severely reduce the overall wealth of the United States. Showing them this connection really emphasizes the stronghold that American slavery had on trade, on land development, as well as technology in America. These topics really are complex. So you have the economic conditions coupled with the evolution of government policies, understanding the social structure, and trying to attempt to give all of the individuals in your narrative agency. This is complicated stuff. This is more than just saying that the enslaved persons worked there, but you're talking about a group of people that had a huge contribution to how the United States formed and how we see the United States today. It is a difficult thing to really iron out. And that's why we consider this a very complicated narrative. So as we're moving through, how are we creating this narrative? How are we creating material that is informative, that is digestible, that is sustainable? It is understanding this idea of dual historicity, where scholars and interpreters and curators are not only focused on the final product of an interpretive script, but also the process of how you're producing the history. So all of that information that I just gave you is part of that process. It's teasing through all of these smaller concepts, how they're combining to make these complex narratives, being transparent to guests, and even staff internally about this process is just as important as that final tour that you give. Because the production of this history is a continuous cycle. Remember that as interpreters, you are constantly educating yourself. You may not be in academia, you may not consider yourself a scholar, but you have the responsibility of sharing this history on a regular basis, which gives you a role in how people form memories, how this information is preserved. And so remember that as you're going through this production of history, you play a role in how people remember these topics. So you may not be a creator, you may be in a repository, a library, an archive. You're holding physical documents that contribute to interpreters researching the topic, the cycle continues. There will always be new pieces of information uncovered. There will always be new types of interpretation that is being shared. And so continuously revising your tours, continuously researching and connecting with repositories to find new materials is how you keep these tours sustainable and relevant, and you maintain the legacy of enslaved persons who may not have had the opportunity to share their own stories during their lifetime. And so this does place a lot of accountability on us. That is a heavy burden. People don't often realize that it's heavy. It's heavy to say that we have the responsibility of maintaining a legacy of millions of people. And so our interpretive choices influence how people understand history. Every person that attends a tour that you give, that attends a lecture, a book series on this topic, when they walk away, what you have said to them will influence how they see history. And even the things that we don't say influence how people digest the information that we give. The choices that you make to leave information out is just as important as the things that you do say. And we all must admit that the things that we don't say, it plays a role in the process of creating and erasing history. That's a lot of accountability that we have to think about. And as you're moving through these interpretive productions of history, every level of society is important. Multiple voices are required. You can't just talk about the slave owners. You have to talk about the enslaved community. You have to talk about the women, the men, the those who you have to talk about freedmen. You have to talk about all of the players in in this economic system, because each voice in that system created to the perpetuation of that system. And for people to understand the totality of it, you have to tell all of these stories. And once you do this, visitors will receive a more accurate picture of the world that these enslaved folks lived in. These are concepts that you need to think about when discussing with your staff and thinking about staff training. Staff training is something we don't think about, but when you are training to do a tour about a topic that makes a whole lot of folks uncomfortable, training is a must. You cannot skip on training. You need to use this training period to remind your staff that history is complicated. You can't fit it into a box. It's not going to be pretty. It's going to be messy. It's going to be ugly. It's going to be complex. And that's okay, because nothing in history is nice and neat. That's just not the universe that we live in. Also, being aware of how you use language. We oftentimes get very comfortable in the language that we use in our safe spaces, but remember that not only do you bring your own trauma and biases to the conversations, guests will bring those as well. So being aware of how you say something is equally as important as what you say. And in that same light, being prepared to accept that folks aren't going to like everything that you say. They're not going to agree with it. And some people come on these tours and they are committed to misunderstanding you. They are committed to misunderstanding you. Don't take it as a personal attack. It is just the way the world is, and you have to be okay with that. And as you get different types of people on these tours, learning to diversify your interpretation methods. If I'm giving a tour to a group of middle school students, I probably won't give the same to a group of, say, some of my senior guests. Not the same type of tour. Some of the same information, but people digest information differently, and being aware of those demographic shifts are important as you move from tour to tour. So at the end of the day, which one will you choose? Will you choose to be a passive record keeper, taking the information and neglecting the narrative, or will you be proactive? Will you try to document as many human experiences as possible? This is a choice that you are going to face every time you stand in front of a group, whether you want to or not. What you choose to say, what you choose not to say, will greatly impact the next group of historians, politicians, different types of individuals. So be mindful of that as you're writing, producing, gathering information, and sharing the information on tours. Now, as a curator and as an interpreter at Andrew Jackson's Hermitage, I really wanted to make sure that the information that we shared with guests was one that was well researched, that acknowledged that there would be a wide number of individuals taking this tour, including different racial demographics, age demographics. And the tour that we created was one that was interactive. It included images of various people on the property, but the tour also focused primarily on the enslaved community. And the tour discussed how these individuals moved in these spaces in relation to the 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 white Jackson family. And that was important for me to provide that type of agency, because these were individuals that at one point weren't even given names. It was just the food was cooked or the clothes were produced here. These individuals had names, they had families, they had personalities, likes and dislikes. And it was taking those different pieces that we found in letters and journals and news articles. We even had some firsthand accounts, was taking that information and trying to create these pictures, these verbal pictures of individuals that lived on this property for so many years. And the first time that I gave this tour was for a group of students, a group of seventh graders. And if you want, if you ever want honest feedback, do your any tour in front of a group of children. They are the most brutally honest people on the planet. And they gave me such great feedback from that initial tour that each time that I was able to give that tour, it just got better. One of the things that we did in the last few years that I was at the Hermitage was create this community committee. This committee was composed of various scholars, community members, and they got together and we discussed what the Hermitage could be doing better, what they could be doing better in terms of interpretation, in terms of community engagement, in terms of programming. And we sat down for an all-day session of, they were really peeling back, peeling back the Band-Aids, almost ripping them off in some sections. And it was a painful process, but it was a necessary process. And at the end of that, we were able to create some real meaningful programs. And the programs that we were able to create towards that last few years of my tenure there were some of the most attended public programs on our enslaved community and African American history that I've seen the whole 10 years that I was there. And it was amazing. It was people from all across Nashville. Some people came from outside of Nashville sharing their stories. They were interested in what we were doing. We had genealogy programs, we had musical lectures, book we had book lectures. It was some of the most amazing experiences that I had when discussing this topic. And we were able to continue some of these relationships after the programming. Another concept that we had always done at the Hermitage was this memorial service program. It was shaped just like almost a funeral program, but it was to acknowledge the enslaved persons who worked and died on this property. And one thing that we started to do was we wanted to make sure that the individuals were not just this blanket name of people. It was they had names, they had individual names, and we took those names and put them on flowers. And at the end of the memorial program, and the people would take the flowers and put them on the memorial site. And each flower represented one of the over 150 names of the enslaved persons that we know of. And it was such a moving experience to see families of all ages participate in this ceremony. If you haven't done this, I highly encourage you to contact someone at the Hermitage. If you're in the area, attend one of these. It happens every February, but it is a beautiful experience, and it really helps people pay honor to the folks that put so much. They literally gave their lives to make sure that the property was sustained. Other types of community engagement with this topic that we use to take the interpretation from the site into the community was lectures just as these, taking the information to conferences, showing people how enslaved communities lived on this property, but also talked about the production of our narratives. So remember, we talked about the production of history and how it's this constantly evolving process. So we literally put a microscope to our process and shared that with the community and let them see exactly how we made mistakes in the past, how we're trying to rectify that, and how we're trying to maintain meaningful relationships with the community that we're in for many generations to come. Also remembering that academia and historiography is just as important in the work that we do. Again, that process of producing history is an ever evolving process. So how do we take that concept and spread it across the entire site? Your gift shops, your bookshelves, making sure that they're stocked with books that talk about those concepts that you introduced on the tour. People are always looking for further reading. You know, I took my dissertation bibliography and the historiography bibliography that I used for my PhD program to our gift shop manager, and we sat down and went through that list to find books that we could place in the gift shop. And these were sources that folks that were professors that were really using some of these to teach history, to teach everyone the information that we're giving. We don't want to make it seem like that material is not accessible. As we're researching, we want you to see what we're researching. We want you to read those secondary and primary sources for yourself. So it was opening up the back end of how we're creating these interpretive narratives and showing people the entire process. Now you'll notice the pictures of the small children. This was some of our other program in our literacy initiatives. We partnered with the public library to do a Girl Scout puppet show, which talked about some of these African American stories You know, we talked about the enslaved community being multifaceted. They were individuals with stories, with families, with likes and dislikes. And talking about African culture is equally as important. Even though you may not be able to directly connect the continent of Africa with your narrative, you know that they exist. And you know that stories, these African stories that were created on an entirely different continent, found their way here. And they were through the enslaved community that we still have some of these stories today. And so introducing younger generation to these older stories was equally as important. One of the more creative ways of interpreting slavery at sites was through food. And it was a concept that just really kind of happened. It was kind of by chance, but everyone connects to food. No matter what generation you're in, no matter what demographic you come from, food has a way of connecting us. And for a topic that is very hard to digest, no pun intended, food seems to be a way to do it. And so in these spaces at the Hermitage that we interpreted the enslaved community, we added food. We talked about what the enslaved community ate. We talked about what was farmed there, that some parts of the property had small gardens that we know were utilized by the enslaved community. How did they use that food? What tools were used? What material was shipped in? What was grown on the property? Who harvested that property? And it's just by looking at these pieces of food in these spaces that sparks all this information. And particularly for young children, you know, they know what cornbread is, but how was that corn harvested? You know, beans and greens and the meat. How was, you know, they recognize these things, but using those as tools to spark conversation. Because once people find something that they can connect with, it's easier for them to really digest those topics that are just really uncomfortable. Now, even though I am no longer at the Hermitage, I'm with the Association of the American Association for State and Local History. We are still helping individuals to really get into the meat of this information, and not just how to create interpretive material, but also how they can make their sites just the best that they can be. And so we offer steps. It is Standards and Excellence Program for History Organizations. And this awesome workbook will help you not only with interpreting topics that may be uncomfortable, but it can help you with community engagement, how to be better stewards of your collection. And it is a self-paced program that we can help you move through. So if you are interested in that workbook, in that program, please reach out to me, or you can visit ASLH's website and we can connect you with our awesome folks in our professional development department. So that is all I have for you this evening. And now I will open this up to questions.
Hey, Ashley, you're muted, I think.
Okay, I wanted to see if you all wanted me to go through the questions myself, or would you like to kind of throw some questions at me? Hi, Joe. I see you, Joe.
Yes, a question, may I?
Sure, go ahead, Joe.
All right, beautiful. So I did write in the chat that my question to you was, I said this, well, my comment was, this is great. Did you submit a proposal for the Slave Dwelling Project upcoming conference? And Rachel started to referee all this, and she said she would make sure you got the message. So I'm just asking directly, because your message that all this, we need to, we need to present it to a wider audience. I think we can do that.
Thanks, Joe. How about I give you a call after this so we can talk about it?
Beautiful. Great answer. Beautiful answer. Thank you.
You're welcome. Let's see.
I've got a question.
Sure.
The seventh grade students, you said they gave you great feedback. What did middle schoolers, what kind of things did they teach you or help you recraft your message, and kind of feedback did you get?
They actually taught me that I wasn't given enough of the hard-hitting information. The information that I gave them was way more watered down than they wanted. They wanted the truth. They wanted all of the facts. They asked some questions that even some of my adult guests didn't ask. They wanted to know about, the treatment of the enslaved community. They wanted to know about, this is why I started including concepts about race, because they wanted to know how are they able to enslave just Black folks. I mean, these were questions I didn't initially think to add, but they wanted to know. And it really hit me hard because I thought that I was easing the experience for them, but that's not what they wanted. They wanted the truth, and they were ready for the truth. And as they're asking the questions, it was kind of funny because the adults kind of slowly stepped back and they kind of looked at me and said, I'm not answering this. How are you going to answer this? And we had a frank conversation. They wanted to know the real deal, and I gave it to them. And so I said, you know what? If these seventh graders can handle these types of questions, there is no reason why I can't include this for my adult guests. No reason at all. Any other questions?
Hi, I have a question.
Yes.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi. First of all, thank you so much. This was absolutely wonderful. I really enjoyed it and learned a lot. I did my master's thesis on Confederate heritage in Civil War museums in the South. And one of the things I noticed was that, as one might imagine, there were these giant silences in the narrative around slavery. And, just these huge gaps and like this sort of, quickly mentioning it here, but then moving on. And they use like euphemisms like plantation society and things like that. And I was wondering if you've come across that and what, if you've, thought of specific ways to address that kind of thing, or museums that are very focused on this Confederate heritage narrative.
Right. Yes, we do see those gaps quite often. And so when you see those gaps, start forcing people to connect the dots, because those monuments, those stories didn't just fall out of the sky. And so start asking questions like, who took care of that land? Who cooked that food? Who built that monument? And once you start making people connect the dots and really make them connect those dots, don't let them kind of skirt around it. It forces people to really talk about those uncomfortable truths. That's what they are. They're uncomfortable truths, but they're truths. And once you do that, it gets those conversations going. And then you can start to think, you can start to talk about, why is this uncomfortable for me to talk about? Why do you think people omitted this from the narrative? And those questions are almost more important than the actual answer that you get at the end of connecting the dots, because it uncovers a larger issue of erasure. And you'll find that in a number of history topics, not just talking about enslaved communities, And I think as historians, that is important because, I talked about this producers of history, and it's so important to talk about that process. So focus on the process, focus on the process of how people created that narrative that you have and why they chose to erase what they did. And you'll start uncovering more of that information. And the people who say, I don't want to talk about that, you're kind of forcing them to talk about the things that they don't want to talk about. It's kind of backhanded, but it works.
Thank you so much.
Mhm.
I think Craig has a question. He's raised his hand. So Craig, if you want to ask away.
Oh, good evening, and thank you. I'm a graduate of the State University of New York at New Paltz. Talk about changing the narrative. Sojourner Truth was born in Ulster County in New York at the same location of my college. And we have used and looked at Sojourner's life as a perspective to make decisions on the campus. For example, the building names were named for the patentees of New Paltz. They were all enslavers, and students expressed concern that they felt uncomfortable living in those slave owner buildings. And it took 2 years. And coincidentally, I know Mr. McGill is on the call. The Slave Dwelling Project was around that time visiting New Paltz, talking about slavery. So it really helped to bring focus to the fact that upstate New York was a real bastion for slavery. It started there in New York, in the area of upstate New York. So again, changing the narrative, using Sojourner Truth, we're going to have a sculpture with her baby as she walks. She walks from freedom a year early. It's going to be very powerful this September, and I'm looking forward to us being able to, again, use Sojourner as our point of reference.
That's awesome. Yeah, definitely. I would say definitely connect back with Joe. I think that is a case study of how folks are trying to do that. I think more folks need to see how institutions are approaching the erasure of history and trying to rectify that. That's an awesome example. Thanks so much for sharing.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Did we have someone? I thought I saw another.
So we got Nicole has her hand up. Nicole, do you want to ask a question? I've never used the hand up method.
Hey Ashley, how you doing?
I'm good.
I did. I know that you mentioned it a little bit, but can you talk some about the importance of mental health for Black interpreters, but then how sites need to or should work to support and understand why that's necessary?
Yes, and as you were talking about that, I'm rocking because it is a very triggering topic for me. Yeah, mental health is a real thing. I'm going to get real comfortable right now because mental health is serious when it comes to interpreting this. And so I want you to kind of, if you need to, I can't see you, close your eyes and kind of walk through this with me. For almost 10 years, I was a Black woman that got in my car at 6 a.m. every morning to go and preserve, oftentimes cleaning, on a former plantation site of a former president every day, every single day. And as the collection manager / curator, I had to clean chandeliers. It was a preservation tactic, but cleaning nonetheless. I was cleaning baseboards. I was repackaging artifacts. I was doing everything I could to protect the interior of that home. But every day at 6 a.m. when it was empty, I was in the spaces that was once walked by people who looked like me. and for as long as I know, I was the only African American employee on staff. I was the only one with a PhD. And I'm walking through these spaces day in and day out. Some people, some guests not respecting the authority that I had. Some people asking for the curator and being extremely confused when I walk out. And at that time, I had a very large afro. I had a huge afro when I walk out, or I had a head wrap on, and I walk out as Dr. Bouknight at the time. And again, I am on a former plantation site that enslaved nearly 150 people at any given time. This was difficult, y'all. I did this for over 10 years. And every year that went by, my psyche got worse. My psyche got worse because it became very hard for me to tell these stories without getting angry. And after I had my daughter, I am, at one point I was pregnant, cleaning baseboards and cleaning textiles at a former plantation site. Can you imagine the internal struggle that I dealt with on a day-to-day basis? I had to have a therapist. I say all that because I had to have a therapist and I had to refocus on my self-care. And self-care is not just bubble baths and a glass of wine. No, this was really trying to heal from generational traumas that were passed down to me because of the skin that I am in and having to do the work that I did for 8 hours a day, 5 days a week, sometimes 7 days a week. That was hard, y'all. And, my story is just one of many of other Black interpreters that have to tell these stories 365 days a year and having to deal with all of the trauma of the individuals of the stories we're telling. We're having to deal with our own trauma. And we're having to deal with all of the trauma that are kind of inflicted on us by guests. Y'all, it's hard. It is hard. If you have interpreters who are of color, try to understand that mental health is important. Encourage therapy. I said that, Chain Me Night of Not Your Mama's History. She talked about getting a therapist. Even if you're not someone of color, get a therapist. Because you need to talk about all of these issues that you are having to describe on a day-to-day basis. Whether you know it or not, it is going to affect you. And so I feel like mental health awareness in the museum field is such an under-discussed topic, but I advocate that every single time that I have these conversations because it is heavy, y'all. It's heavy. I know we don't use the term difficult topic, but it's difficult for us to interpret. And I really encourage you all, if we have board members on the call, if we have other administrative staff, remember the mental health toll that these topics take on your staff members. And have safe spaces where they can discuss these items, giving folks a break. All of the little things matter so much. And I know I've taken a lot of time on that, but it is a huge part of interpreting slavery that more people need to really take time with in their training programs. And I'll get off my soapbox.
Thank you so much. I know that was somewhat triggering, but I really appreciate it.
No problem.
Sean, did you want to ask a question?
Yeah, so I work at a small historic plantation, and I've been trying to work on a little bit of the interpretation. And, I always try to focus on material culture with documentation, things like that. And I've been hitting a brick wall with the lack of really much of anything on the individuals, except for maybe one or two. And
Uh-oh, Sean, you cut out there just
as much as we want to and more of their actual narrative into the story of the place, it's been a little difficult trying to figure out how to weigh, well, this is the only stories we have is like maybe on one or two people versus, well, obviously there was more than two people living here. What's the balance of maybe not, I wouldn't say stretching the truth, but like, well, if this maybe happened in a simpler place close by, would it have likely happened at our site versus we're only going to stick with what we know here, and kind of the brick wall that kind of creates for those like myself facing this kind of lack of documentation. I didn't know if you have any tips or any kind of like way to kind of dive into any of that type of problems.
Mm-hmm. Your problem can actually be your solution, to be honest with you, is sharing exactly what you told me in your interpretive material, is saying that we lack the documents, that we can't find all of the names of the persons who were on the site. We don't know as much about who these people are. Just say exactly that, because what it shows that process of producing the history that I was talking about. And it also reminds people that this is an ever evolving topic, that you're constantly in need of researching. You're constantly going to be in need of making connections with repositories. But when you open yourself up with this type of transparency, it also puts out a call for people in your surrounding area who may have stories. There are people who are sitting on gold mines of information, but they don't think it's important because no one's ever told them it was important. Or they may be waiting for you to reach out to say that we want to create stronger relationships with the community, with descendants, and you'll be surprised at the mysterious phone calls that you might get. But in your current space, go ahead and say that we don't know, but then talk about why you don't know and what it means to not know this information to the grand scheme of your interpretive plan. That's important. People want to know that. People want to know, why can't I find material on enslaved community? Why can't I learn more about the people that are there? And it opens up this door to conversations for folks who may not have thought about why the material culture of enslaved folks weren't given as much value to be saved as those who were not of color, if that makes sense.
I'd like to add that widening your research net may help you as well, because if this is one small plantation, they likely had relatives that were nearby, and so maybe you start looking in their family papers, you might find connections to your site. It's just sometimes the information you're finding just is not in the places you're looking.
Fair enough. I appreciate both of y'all's help and feedback.
I think Joe McGill has got his hand up again if he wants to jump in.
Yes. Doctor, I think I heard from you first that if certain states, they paid taxes at certain ages on enslaved people. I think I heard the age 12 and 55. Now again, I think I heard that from you first. Can you expand on that?
Sure. So when individuals were creating tax records, and this is important when you're looking at trying to locate families or other individuals, that all persons on the tax records that's not the end all be all to those names of individuals, because taxable slaves were only listed on those inventory lists. And taxable means those who are between the ages of 12 and 50. And any persons who are outside of those ages, there may have been, people younger than 12. There may have been people, 100 plus, but they won't be on those physical inventory records. So you have to kind of find other like family records, family journals, to find out who was on the property beyond what was on those tax records.
Thank you.
Mhm.
Just something I'd like to add. I enjoyed Craig's commentary about New York and Sojourner Truth and it kind of made me realize, and it connected to what you were saying about how the whole country's connected in an economic system. So just because there weren't slaves in the North or as many slaves in the North doesn't mean that the South and the North weren't interconnected. And there is a space and a role to interpret slavery and the Underground Railroad in the North.
Mm-hmm.
But also I think it goes beyond the Underground Railroad. It's that there is an economic system in the North that was intertwined with the South. The region in the Midwest was supplying Southern plantations with manufactured goods and food, because plantations are basically factories for creating cotton or tobacco or other cash crops like that. So it's what you're talking about is not just about Southern plantations of the South. It's really about our whole country.
Exactly. And people forget that, and you have to remind them that this was everybody working together to oppress an entire group of people based on the social construct of race. And that system lasted for over 400 years because it was heavily tied to our economic state. That's a lot for people to digest, but it's the truth. And I have to constantly remind people of that on tours. Thank you, Rachel.
That's my hand. I was just going to add to what you and Blake and even Joe have mentioned about the North and the South and the socioeconomic realities of slavery, and then how even the international realities of slavery also play into American slavery, particularly when we're looking at the Civil War with England and France, especially, really thinking about supporting the Confederacy because of textiles, because of the cotton trade, and the goods that are being produced by the enslaved men, women, and children in the South. And I think that it's really an important conversation to have on the expansiveness of slavery. I think so many people think that it was just relegated to very large plantations, but it could even be farms. There could have been a yeoman farmer even with one or two enslaved persons, whereas 10 miles down the road, there is a larger plantation with 150, like Andrew Jackson's Hermitage, or even more than even he had. And it's interesting because of where we are in Middle Tennessee. I think a lot of people go, well, these are not really plantations; they're considered farms. A lot of the part of the slaveocracy had larger plantations in the deeper South, especially those here in Middle Tennessee. And that story is an undervalued, undersourced connection to our history here in Tennessee, and really kind of displaying individuals, whether we're looking at McGavick's or Polk's, or even Jackson himself, with his expansive land in his real estate collection, basically, of what he was doing, or the interconnected nature between all of these families, as Blake was saying earlier, with you know, kind of look outside the box of the family that's just on that one plantation, and who are they married to, who are their cousins, who are they politically connected to, because some of the research that he and I are doing right now, you can just see the little spider webs that go out that connect these dots, and every single individual has their hand on slavery, you know, and their ties to slavery. I thought, yeah, I had an eye-opening experience when I took my kids to the Whitney plantation 3 years ago, and they were teenagers, and they go all over the place to you know, historic house museums, so they weren't thrilled about it. But I've never seen kids so engaged, because they had an African American tour guide who was really giving this participatory experience through interpretation of slavery. And my kids left there after 90 minutes being outside on the tour, just blown away, asking questions. And even today, they talk about being there because they had a greater understanding than when they left. And I think that the work that you have done, and the work of Nicole and of Joe and so many others who are our friends and colleagues, we commend you for your efforts. And I'm just really glad that you're sharing these stories, because you're right, kids want to know the truth these days. And I think as adults, we want to be a little careful of how we're presenting that information. But in reality, they have the world at their fingertips, and they want to be told the truth, because they feel as though they've not been told the truth for a long time. And I see that with Gen X, I see that with millennials and Gen Z particularly. And I'm looking forward to seeing how the work that we're continuing to do, though difficult that it is, especially when we're having to change people's perceptions and perspectives on how we talk candidly and honestly about slavery. I'm hoping that we can continue to have these conversations and look to you all and your work as scholars and academics that work at plantations or within historic organizations to kind of lead us in that continuing conversation.
Absolutely. And I know that we are coming close to the end of time, but I want to echo your sentiments about the Whitney Plantation. It is a great example of how to do this type of interpretive work. And I wholeheartedly believe that the reason why it is so impactful is because they frame the narratives about the enslaved community through the lens of resistance.
Mm-hmm.
And as you are creating your own interpretive plans and tours, think about this idea of resistance and what resistance to this system look like for the enslaved community. It will definitely give you an eye-opening experience, and it will give your guests a different perspective that they weren't expecting. And it will just provide for a much more richer experience by looking at it.
I completely agree.
Any final questions from our audience? Well, I would just like to thank Dr. I'm gonna call you Dr. Ashley. Bouknight-Claybrooks, there we go. Thank you for your presentation tonight. Rachel, did you want to thank her as well?
Yes, thank you so much, Ashley. This has been phenomenal. There have been multiple comments, and I've been kind of responding to people back and forth during your presentation, but everyone has said that this has been a phenomenal presentation, and they would love to know, if possible, you'd be willing to share your PowerPoint presentation.
Yeah.
I think we have a lot of people who are museum educators, or they work at historic sites where they're in the depths of talking about slavery. And I think your insight from your PowerPoint presentation would help them. So if you're willing to do that, if you want to email it to us, and then we'll be able to to get that out there to everyone, we'd be happy to share that if you're okay with it.
Sure. I want everyone to be able to get as much information as possible so they can really start interpreting this topic to the best of their ability.
And we will post this on YouTube probably early next week.
Yeah.
Sounds great.
Yes.
All right. Thank you again.
Thank you, Dr.
you.
Bouknight-Claybrooks. We appreciate it.
Thank you. You all have a good evening.
You too, and everyone have a good night. Thank you for joining us.
Bye.
Bye.